Today's episode of Off the Timeline is titled The NFL Coach Who Changed Vanderbilt and Accidentally Changed the SEC. In this alternate universe, the story begins with a phone call most people forget ever happened. Early 1981, Nashville. A frustrated NFL assistant coach sits in a hotel room staring at a legal pad filled with crossed out opportunities. The NFL thinks he's difficult, too demanding, too abrasive, too controlling, and for the first time in years, Bill Parcells begins wondering if professional football may never fully trust him. At almost the exact same moment, inside a quiet room at Vanderbilt, a small group of boosters arrive at a dangerous conclusion. Vanderbilt football cannot survive by trying to be respectable. It has to become different. Within weeks, the school makes one of the strangest offers in college football history. Not a large salary, not facilities, not prestige, but control, complete control. And in this alternate universe, Bill Parcells says yes. Years later, people would argue about what happened next. Some called it the modernization of Southern football. Others called it the moment the SEC lost its personality. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. By the end of the 1980s, college football no longer looked the same, and somehow it all traced back to Vanderbilt. And that sets the table for the perfect experiment. To understand why this happened, we have to understand what the SEC looked like in the early 80s. The conference still revolved around regional recruiting, old coaching networks, physical practices, conservative offenses, and institutional power. Alabama still carried the shadow of Bear Bryant across the conference. LSU was searching for consistency while protecting its recruiting territory. And Vanderbilt occupied a strange place in the SEC ecosystem. Academically respected, athletically overlooked, the school people scheduled for homecoming. But from Parcells' perspective, that weakness was actually freedom. Nobody expected Vanderbilt to matter. That meant nobody was watching closely. Former players later described the first months under Parcells as a shock to the system. Practices changed immediately. Conditioning intensified. Film study expanded dramatically. Position meetings became longer and more detailed. Parcells introduced NFL terminology, layered scouting reports, substitution planning, opponent tendency charts, and personnel grading systems rarely seen in college football at the time. Some Vanderbilt players transferred. Others stayed and slowly realized something unusual was happening. The Commodores were no longer preparing like a traditional SEC team. They were preparing like a professional organization. And that sets the table for the first signs. The 1981 season was not glamorous. Vanderbilt finished 3-8. But coaches around the conference noticed something unsettling. The Commodores no longer looked disorganized. They tackled better, committed fewer mistakes, stayed competitive late in games, and most importantly, they played with structure. An assistant coach from another SEC program would later described the feeling this way. You expected Vanderbilt to break eventually, but they didn't. Every quarter felt exactly the same. At first, most of the conference dismissed it as temporary, a motivational gimmick, an NFL coach trying college football. But inside coaching offices, film study of Vanderbilt quietly increased, especially in Tuscaloosa, because Alabama noticed something before anyone else did. Parcells wasn't trying to build Vanderbilt into Alabama, he was trying to build something entirely different. And that sets the table for the Maryland pipeline. The next breakthrough came miles away from Nashville in the mid-Atlantic. Parcells quickly realized Vanderbilt could never consistently out-recruit traditional SEC powers in the South. So instead of going up against Alabama and LSU directly for elite local stars, he attacked other geography. The staff began focusing on Maryland, D.C., New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and overlooked areas from the Northeast Corridor. At the same time, a young assistant with recruiting ties to Maryland joins Vanderbilt's staff. Together, they built something unusual, a mid-Atlantic to SEC pipeline. The players Vanderbilt landed were rarely superstars, but they were disciplined, tough, experienced. Many came from systems closer to professional football structures than traditional Southern high school programs, and gradually, Vanderbilt began looking physically older than opponents expected. Not more talented, older, stronger, more organized. Years later, some Maryland fans would look back at the era and wonder whether Vanderbilt accidentally recruited the kind of roster Maryland itself could have had. And that sets the table for the LSU game. This is the first true turning point and happened 1983 in Baton Rouge. LSU entered the game expecting a routine matchup. Instead, Vanderbilt controlled the tempo from the opening quarter. The game did end 17-13 in LSU's favor, but the score barely mattered afterwards. What people remembered was how Vanderbilt looked. The sideline appeared coordinated. Substitutions happened instantly. Players rotated with precision. The defense remained fresh into the fourth quarter. An LSU assistant coach reportedly told a colleague afterwards, that looked more like playing a Sunday team than a college team. For the first time, the SEC began considering a possibility that previously sounded crazy. What if Vanderbilt found an inefficiency the rest of the conference ignored? And that sets the table to Alabama starting to pay attention. 2 years later, 1985, Vanderbilt travels to Tuscaloosa. By then, Parcells had slowly transformed the Commodores into one of the most physical teams in the conference. Not exciting, not flashy, but physical. The game itself became an SEC classic. Alabama eventually did win 20-17, but afterward the conversation moved away from the final score. Former Alabama players later described feeling surprised by Vanderbilt's discipline. The Commodores substituted faster, protected the football, controlled field position, and maintained intensity for 4 full quarters. One longtime Alabama booster reportedly left the stadium saying, if Vanderbilt ever recruits at a high level, the entire SEC changes. That sentence lingered, because by the mid-1980s, the SEC's traditional powers had quietly begun adapting. Conditioning programs expanded, film study intensified, scouting departments became even more detailed. The league was changing, and Vanderbilt had become impossible to ignore. And that sets the table for the Louisiana problem. But nowhere did the transformation create more frustration than Louisiana. Parcells never consistently beat LSU for five-star recruits. No matter how good of a coach he was, that's just plain out unrealistic. Instead, Vanderbilt specialized in identifying overlooked players Louisiana schools underestimated. Undersized linebackers, small town linemen, hard hitting defensive backs, players who fit Parcells' system perfectly. And then Vanderbilt developed them aggressively. By 1986, NFL scouts had started visiting Vanderbilt practices on the regular. That alone felt surreal. What frustrated LSU observers most was the pattern. Vanderbilt players consistently appeared technically sharper, more conditioned, and more NFL ready than expected. One Louisiana columnist famously wrote, Vanderbilt isn't taking Louisiana talent, they're taking Louisiana toughness. That line spreads across the SEC, and suddenly Vanderbilt games were no longer curiosities. They became measuring sticks. And that sets the table for Nashville starting to pay attention. As Vanderbilt evolved, so did Nashville itself. The city was beginning to grow beyond its traditional identity as simply the center of country music. Media companies expanded, regional TV influence increased, and national attention slowly followed. Parcells recognized an opportunity before most college programs did. Vanderbilt could never dominate through sheer recruiting power, but perhaps it could become TV's most intriguing team. The program began experimenting with aggressive scheduling, primetime kickoffs, cleaner sideline presentation, more coordinated media access, and TV-friendly production ideas that felt closer to the NFL than traditional college football. By the late 1980s, ESPN producers had become fascinated by Vanderbilt, not because they were national title contenders, because they looked different, professional, intentional, modern. And for audiences around the country, that difference became compelling television. And that sets the table for the tree spreading. The real impact of the Vanderbilt experiment didn't stay in Nashville. It spread through assistant coaches. Former Parcells assistants began appearing across football, in SEC programs, NFL staffs, at Maryland, in recruiting departments, and eventually throughout the sport itself. With them came more advanced scouting, heavier film analysis, expanded strength programs, specialized personnel groupings, and increasingly professional structures. Years later, historians of the sport would debate how much influence Vanderbilt truly had on the modernization of college football, but the timeline was difficult to ignore. By the early 90s, many ideas once viewed as strange Vanderbilt experiments had become standard practice. And that sets the table to the exit. In 1989, the NFL called again. This time, Parcells accepts. He left Vanderbilt without a national championship, without even an SEC title, without building a traditional dynasty. But in another way, his impact was far larger, because by the time he departed, Alabama had modernized portions of its football infrastructure, LSU had reshaped recruiting Maryland had adapted elements of the Vanderbilt model. TV executives viewed the SEC differently, and assistant coaches from Nashville had spread throughout football. The SEC survived the decade, but no longer resembled the conference Parcells entered in 1981. And in this alternate universe, the strangest part remains this: the coach who changed Southern football forever never actually intended to stay there. So, what do you think? Could Bill Parcells have really transformed Vanderbilt into the program that accelerated the SEC's modernization? Would Alabama eventually have adapted anyway? Could LSU have stopped the recruiting change? And how differently would college football history look today if Vanderbilt had become the sport's first true NFL style program? Now, if you enjoyed this college football alternate history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know which alternate universe we should explore next. And I'll see you in the next timeline.